Joining us on the pod, she is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and the host of the paper's podcast, Sway. She is also the co-host of the podcast, Pivot. Please welcome back Kara Swisher. Kara, good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, so we had some big news. Word got out late last week that Facebook was going to make a big announcement affecting Donald Trump's place on the platform. They announced that Trump would be suspended for 2 years, starting from January 7th, a fitting day, the day after the insurrection. I think that's actually quite notable. And that in time, they will evaluate whether or not the threat has receded.
Yeah.
What led to this decision and what was your reaction to it?
Well, they've been kicking this can down the road forever, right? They've been sort of indulging him for the past 5 years or 4 years or whatever, from way back before he was president. And so he's been sort of allowed to misbehave the entire time, and it's and continue to escalate it up until and including January 7th, when his posts were rather dangerous and they inflamed people and incited violence, among other things. He gave a speech too. There were other things, but the way he behaved on social media certainly didn't help the situation, as they say. And he kept posting his speeches, and when he posted several of his speeches, they were problematic because they were sort of egging people on. That's what it was under the determination. And so he finally, after violating their rules quite a lot, they kicked him off, and that was that. He just violated the rules one too many times. And so then they decided then to sort of kick it. What they did is they gave him Facebook. Twitter permanently banned Trump, just said, forget it. That's enough. We've had enough. And which they should have done much earlier. Lots of people could see where this was going. And then YouTube, he's still sort of in limbo there a little bit. But Facebook did this weird thing called indefinitely ban, which is like, I didn't like either. You can't indefinitely jail someone. You can't, it was just weird. And what it was they didn't want to make a decision in any direction whatsoever. So they didn't piss off anyone, but they ended up pissing off everybody. And so then they kicked it over to the Facebook board, which is a board, an independent board that is paid for by Facebook and was selected by Facebook, of 20 people. It's supposed to be 40 around the globe. And they kicked it over to that group, which it is independent. It's not, but it isn't. Like, you know what I mean? It's hard to be independent when it's paid and picked by Facebook, but
isn't it a trust, or isn't it now paid for by some kind of a trust?
It is. It's just the origins are problematic, no matter how they slice it. And I have called them a UN, but 100% less effective. Like, how can they deal with this thing? But it's some very good people on this board, not enough critics, but that's okay. And so what they did, which I thought was pretty terrific, is they pointed out the obvious, which a lot of us have pointing out, is you have no rules, and we're not ruling it on it for you. You don't have any policies. And in fact, the policy you kept pointing to about newsworthiness doesn't even exist. And so it was crazy. I was like, yeah. Like, why don't you do it? So they kicked it back to Zuckerberg and said, you figure it out. This is your problem. You created it. We're not going to solve it for you. And then later, if we don't agree with your policy, we'll talk about that. But you're the ones that have to make the policy, not us. And so they kicked it back to them. And now this was the decision, which is sort of a half measure, which is 2 years. We'll see how he does. And then we'll evaluate it then. And I think they're hoping something will happen in the 2-year interim. I don't know what, that they don't have to make a decision, whether whatever happens to him. And so in 2 years, they'll decide if he continues to be a problem, or if the public discourse is so inflamed by Trumpism that, and the sort of mini, the 1,000 duck-sized Trumps are around, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And what's interesting is there was a story in the New York Times today showing that the minute they kicked him off, there was definitely a decline in people being inflamed, but then all these other things keep amplifying him. So it's the same difference, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about next, actually. So because Facebook and we all do this. We're doing this. Trump has an ability to make us do this. We focus on this individual to the detriment of the systems and processes taking place all around him. The point that you make is, yes, the Times today has this great analysis. They use some information from the Global Disinformation Index, and they found that on a host of issues, Trump is gone. Trump doesn't have the reach he once did, but his words are promoted. His ideas are promoted in some cases to the same degree, except on issues of election disinformation, because the platforms had other rules, irrespective of Trump as one person, that prevented that information from being spread. And it sort of goes to the systemic problems that Facebook still is not willing to address, right?
Right. And I think that's the problem, is that the die is already cast here. And the people who run these systems, not the Facebook people, the people who use them know how to manipulate them and move them around. You don't have to have, now look, a Donald Trump tweet, good for cable discussion, good for this, good for that. The plug thing that he didn't work out. Like nobody was like rushing to report it. They're just like, oh, he said this crazy thing, but it didn't have the same impact, right? Or the same urgency. And he didn't have the global platform of the White House, which is another thing. He can walk downstairs and say whatever he wants. And so there is some, it not coming from him, and his speech was kind of like, it's kind of flopped, and it didn't get the same kind of pickup, like the oh wow pickup. And then everything was focused on his pants, which was a lie, which is wearing his pants on, that was a fake Photoshop, whatever that was. So he doesn't have the same ability to generate attention to himself, but it doesn't mean his ideas don't get out there. And so that the system's in place for amplification of bad things. And that's one of the big issues, obviously, because of the size of these platforms.
So there were two other pieces of this decision that actually have, I think, larger implications. One is around this completely gauzy, cloudy idea, foggy idea of newsworthiness as an exception for honesty, or the rules of their platform. Right. And they're going to keep that, but apply it to everybody. It's a bit confusing. But the bigger decision was saying that they're going to treat politicians like they treat any old user.
Yes, should.
That seems good. That seems like a really positive change. What would you make of it?
Well, Mark was very particular. Like we want that speech he gave. I happened to be at that speech at Georgetown where he talked about that. Let's have the politicians speak. It's more important to have them speak than to police what they're saying, especially if it's bad. Including if it's bad. And I was there, and he was sort of describing a state of free speech in the First Amendment that didn't exist. You know what I mean? Like I was like, why can they violate platform rules that you have for everybody else? Why can't everybody else say it then? And it had no intellect. I literally almost jumped up from the audience and started yelling at him, like, go take a history course. Here at Georgetown where I went, like, you can learn, here's a law class, here's this class. And so they, what's interesting about them is that they change their tune all the time. Like this is the way it is. And then this is the way it is. And one of the things that drives me crazy is, a couple of years ago, I had this famous interview where he talked about Holocaust deniers, and we're gonna keep them on the platform. And then 2 years later, no, they're terrible. And then people can change their minds, but the damage in the interim. Same thing with Alex Jones. No, Kara, we're not taking them off. Oh, you will, because he keeps violating your rules, and eventually you're gonna have to. Then they take him off. Same thing here. Like I'm glad they did it, but it was like way too late. And I hate to be like, well, too little, too late, but that's really what it feels like in a lot of ways. And it's not enough either. It's not they don't want to, they want to sort of stutter step their way into this while huge amounts of damage is happening all over the place. And that's my problem with it.
Yeah, it does seem, you talked about this in your piece. You said that Mark Zuckerberg is naive. And I found that interesting. I
didn't use the word naive. The headline was, but go ahead. I think he's a chump. I think he's a chump, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I would say the headline was fair, a fair description of what you said in the piece, which is basically has this sort of like college dorm room idea of how speech works, right? Well, if a politician lies, people should see the lie so that they know that they're a liar, as if people are these great adjudicators of fact because they have access to some other body of information.
Sure.
And that Trump took advantage of that. But it does seem like that reluctance that he has is like infused in everything that Facebook does, including this decision. You have Nick Clegg, the spokesperson for Facebook, basically saying how, we can't please everybody. This is a problem from both sides.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, and now we're waiting for, really, it shouldn't be up to Facebook. It should be up to governments. He's just sort of like, it's a very like almost like S&M thing, like bind us, but daddy,
They can't act. The government has the First Amendment. Like they can't.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any. Of course it doesn't. Nick Clegg is highly paid to not make sense for a lot of things. And I like Nick Clegg, and I think he's very smart. He did call me that commentator on TV this week. It was that commentator, that one, and it annoys us. But it's kind of irritating to have them try to play games. It's like, look, taking Donald Trump off was the correct thing to do. You can scream censorship all you want, but he broke the rules. And in any other business, if he broke the rules the way he broke the rules here, if he kept crashing his car drunkenly into people, he would be taken off the road. If he ran into a restaurant and peed in people's soup, he'd be not allowed to go into restaurants and he'd be arrested. This is like if he walked around naked, God forbid, he'd be arrested. Like, we all follow rules all the time. And for some reason, the idea that he has the God-given right to be on Facebook is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. That said, we can have a big discussion about the fact that there's one major social platform and it's too big, and it shouldn't be the one to decide the fate of the American president. That is a really good debate to have. It's separate from this other debate, and it's about size and scope and power. And there's two things going on here. Did Donald Trump break the rules of Facebook and Twitter badly over and over and over again? Did he, it was interesting. The Times used the word desecrate their rules. I had piss on and then kicked. Like, that's what he did. He pissed on them, then he kicked them, and then he kicked them again for good measure. And he gets kicked off for that. That's a separate argument. And then what do we do about the fact that these companies are so big and powerful that they become public utilities? Should we designate them public utilities, which is what Clarence Thomas was sort of arguing? I don't know. We should talk about it. Maybe not. I don't agree with that, but we certainly should have a cogent debate about their power at the same time and separate the two.
Yeah, no, it's interesting though. You said two things. You said size and you said scope. And it's actually, I think there's an important distinction there, because in some sense, social networks depend on size, right? Mm-hmm. Like, a social network is only as good as the base of users that it has. There's a network effect, right? Like, one of these things takes off, kills the rest. RIP MySpace, RIP Friendster, right? But so in some sense, there's an inherent monopolistic part of social networking that they're only as useful as the size of how many people they reach. And then you talked about scope, right? Facebook gobbles up WhatsApp, it gobbles up Instagram, it copies Snapchat, it does all of these things. How do you make that distinction, right? Like, I want these companies to be less powerful, but I also recognize that social networks that reach everybody are valuable. That's part of their value.
They are. There's a lot of things you could do. There's interoperability. The Facebook shares information, that there could be new companies that talk to each other, right? That there's all kinds of ways to do this. But you're right. These social networks benefit by being larger, and they're more useful by being larger. And as they suck up everything, they get to be the arbiters of truth, which Mark never wanted to be. But that's what, I always think in that speech, he said, I don't want to be an arbiter of truth. And I'm like, then why did you build a platform that forced it to needing one? You need one here. And even if your truth is different than other people's, this is what this platform requires. And so when it comes down to it, you have to we're smart people. We can figure out how to make these networks so that there could be many more companies like this that can interoperate with each other. Texts now, remember when text didn't interoperate with each other? When you were only on the Apple text or on this text, they figured it out, right? And so how can we create social networks? So there's all kinds of social networks where you see, where you can look at things and belong to things and yet move. I don't know, or make it a public utility, and then the government can step in and regulate it more. I still think the government will never be able to regulate speech on any of these platforms. Never.
No, I think that, it has all the same challenges that Facebook is facing when it is basically a quasi-government entity at this point, plus a whole host of others that are far more dangerous because it's the government and they have tanks.
Yeah, they can't. And one of the things that drives me crazy, the last thing is the right, like, who was it? The one from Louisiana, the senator, she was going on and on about it being a free speech question. And if it's not, if it's Trump today, it's you tomorrow. And what's incredible is the lack of understanding about the First Amendment. No, it's not. If you do something like Trump did, which is incite violence, yes, it will be you tomorrow. Getting, the whole anti-cancel culture crowd, I appreciate a lot of some of the stuff that people talk about cancel culture, but in some ways it's ridiculously out of hand, in that if people violate rules, guess what? You get arrested. You just do. And that's really one of the things. And to conflate it with free speech is another thing. And to conflate it with the ability of people to be heard is a wholly different argument. And mashing them together creates a real problem for all of us, because you have to separate them.
It's Mark Zuckerberg saying, I don't want to be an arbiter of truth, yet burying within the options the ability to see posts as they happen, right? Like it's I don't want to be seen as the arbiter of truth, or I don't want to be held accountable as an arbiter of truth. Dan Pfeiffer pointed this out on Pod Save America last week, which is, Donald Trump just shut down his blog because he didn't like it being made fun of because nobody was going to it. Here is this figure, this larger than life political figure, leader of the Republican Party, dominated social media, dominated Twitter, dominated Facebook. Absent the automatic algorithm-based sharing of his content, it foundered. And that tells you something.
Yep. He's good. Twitter's good for him. He needs to be on Twitter. That's what it tells me. I wrote that column. I said, without Twitter, he's nothing. He doesn't have anywhere to go. Even Facebook isn't good enough because he can't do as much damage there. And so I think 3 years ago, I'm like, if he gets kicked off Twitter, that's the end of this for this part. That said, I still think he has enormous influence because there's all these polling, of course, that shows the support among Republicans of Donald Trump is quite strong. And that's all that matters in the end, not whether he has a zillion social media followers. It's what he can do to them, what his influence can do to them with the voters. And that's why you have all these relatively reasonable people mouthing this endless bullshit. They're just looking at those polls and they're seeing a lot of support for Donald Trump. And until that ends, they will continue to do any kind of pretzel around him. And then the crazies will stick with him no matter what. So that's what they do. Like the Marjorie Taylor Greens are just going to go on to the bitter end.
And, we have QAnon conferences. And so, and as we started...
It will be bitter. It will be a bitter end for them,
One hopes.
Or us.
Or someone. The end, there will be bitterness and there will be an end. But and just to go back to where we started, it's not just about removing a person. It's about removing the systems of spreading misinformation, which mattered far more than just deplatforming individuals. You have to actually have a system in place for saying, hey, this is beyond the pale. This doesn't exist here. And I hope what Facebook and Twitter learned from this is that if you don't enforce your rules, you will pay double later. If you wait, you will pay double later. One last question for you, Kara. Jeff Bezos is going to space. What should we do while he's gone? And do you think it's at all odd that this will be the first time in his career as an Amazon employee he will be peeing into a container?
Someone was putting that on Twitter. He can wear diapers like his employees. I do want to comment on that. I think it's a funny tweet. He really is a geek. He was always sort of a Star Trek fan, particularly Star Trek, and I think has always wanted to do this, wanted to go into space. He has. It's something he's talked about. He likes the outfits. Same thing. I think Richard Branson's heading there. And of course, Elon hasn't told us when he's going yet. So it's kind of an interesting lost in space moment. It would be interesting if he got lost in space. Like if that was like a plot, you could have like a movie.
It's like there's this like midlife crisis billionaire escalation. It's like
I applaud him for that. Like it's not just sexting.
Not a yacht.
It's not, no, but he did sexting and then he got an outfit. He got an outfit change. He changed his body. He he may have a yacht. I'm sure he has a yacht. He did the whole 9 years and now it's space. I'm like, okay, all right.
You know what? Maybe if you go far enough into space, Jeff, you'll be popular in high school. It's possible. It's possible.
Popular. I don't think he wasn't popular. I don't think that's what he suffers from. I don't think that's his. I think many people in tech possibly suffer from that, although it's kind of a trope. But he's a character. Let's just say he's a character. I wonder what Elon Musk is thinking today because they don't like each other. That seems to be obvious.
Well, we always wonder what
I want Elon in space. I think that'll just be fantastic. Like, what does he do up there? Like, who knows what he'll do? I know he shouldn't be so amusing. Sometimes he says terrible things, but and he does a lot. Does that a lot. But I want to see. I want to see them both. I have an idea for a TV series where they both end up on Mars, like by themselves, like and they can't get back, and they're together in like one of those Matt Damon huts, and they have to grow potatoes together. That's what I want to see. Like,
I'm into it. Into it. That's a great idea.
Two of them, like
let's get that made. Look, I've said this on this show before, but if you do pitch an idea on a podcast, technically Netflix owns the rights, so we should just be really careful.
I already have whatever did copyrighted it anyway.
Kara Swisher, always good to see you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.